in their compound eyes. Like monumentally terrible, the kind of mistake that ends up in training manuals under what not to do ever. The lead guard, whom Steve had mentally dubbed Bugsy, chittered something that the universal translator rendered as, "Silence, primitive. You'll soon learn your place in the galactic hierarchy." The translator even managed to capture the sneer in his voice, which Steve had to admit was technically impressive. "Look," Steve tried again, maintaining his casual tone while leaning against the energy barrier. "I get it. You guys are the big bad Zax-Thulian Empire. You've conquered half the Orion Arm. You've got ships the size of moons. Very impressive resume. But throwing me in with the dragons? That's just, well, it's kind of mean to the dragons, honestly." The guards paused their approach, mandibles twitching in what Steve recognized as their species equivalent of laughter. The one he'd named Antenna Bob spoke up. "The Pyrethian flame drakes have devoured creatures far more impressive than you, human. Your species' arrogance is legendary, but even you must recognize the futility of your situation." Steve sighed, running a hand through his disheveled brown hair. "Okay, let me try one more time. I'm not worried about me. I'm worried about your dragons. I'm a zookeeper from the Sydney Interplanetary Wildlife Park. My literal job is handling dangerous creatures. The dragons? They're basically just big lizards with a metabolism problem." The energy barrier dissolved, and 4 sets of chitinous arms reached in to grab him. Steve didn't resist as they dragged him down the corridor, their feet clicking against the metallic floor in an almost musical rhythm. "You know what?" Steve said conversationally as they marched him toward his doom. "I'm actually kind of excited. I've only ever seen Pyrethian flame drakes in holovids. Did you know they're technically not even reptiles? They're silicon-based life forms that evolved to mimic the appearance of Earth's prehistoric creatures. Fascinating example of convergent evolution." "Your species' last words are always so strange," Bugsy commented, mandibles clicking in amusement. "Most prisoners beg for mercy. You lecture about biology." They reached a massive door marked with warning symbols in at least 12 different languages. Steve could make out danger and deadly force among the translations, along with what appeared to be a pictogram of something being enthusiastically eaten. "For the record," Steve said as they initiated the door's opening sequence, "I really did try to warn you. Whatever happens next is on you guys." The door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a cavernous chamber bathed in the reddish glow of artificial magma streams. 3 enormous creatures lay curled around various heat sources, their crystalline scales reflecting the light like living prisms. They raised their angular heads as the door opened, multifaceted eyes gleaming with predatory interest. "Last chance," Steve offered helpfully. The guards responded by shoving him into the chamber and sealing the door behind him. Steve brushed himself off, straightened his slightly singed jumpsuit, and turned to face the approaching dragons. "Right then," he muttered, reaching into his boot to retrieve the small metal clicker he'd managed to keep hidden during his capture. "Let's see if you lot respond to positive reinforcement like your cousins back home." The largest drake, a magnificent specimen nearly 40 feet long, reared up to its full height and opened its crystalline maw, revealing rows of diamond-sharp teeth and the telltale glow of its internal furnace preparing to unleash a blast of plasma-hot flame. Steve clicked the training device twice and spoke in a firm, clear voice. "Sit." To the astonished watching guards, what happened next would have seemed impossible had they not witnessed it through their surveillance systems. The drake paused, head tilting in curious recognition of the command tone that seemed hardwired into predatory species across the galaxy. Its siblings, equally massive and theoretically equally lethal, also showed interest. "Good boy," Steve said, clicking again and reaching into another hidden pocket. "Now, who wants a treat? I've got some dehydrated methane crystals here somewhere." 20 minutes later, the guards were still watching in horrified fascination as all 3 Pyrethian flame drakes performed tricks for treats, responding to commands like eager puppies. Steve had them rolling over, playing dead, which involved a lot of dramatic flopping from creatures the size of buses, and even trying to shake hands with their proportionally tiny front claws. "The thing about predators," Steve lectured to his captive audience through the surveillance system, while scratching behind the largest drake's sensory crests, "is that they're generally pretty intelligent. Intelligence means they can learn. Learning means they can be trained. Really, this is just basic xenozoology. You guys should read up on it sometime." He paused to toss a treat to the smallest drake, who caught it with surprising delicacy. "Also, pro tip, always check your prisoners for pet training equipment. especially the ones who keep telling you they work with dangerous animals for a living. Through the viewing window, Steve could see various high-ranking Zexthulians arriving to witness the impossible scene. Their antennae were practically tied in knots with agitation. He waved cheerfully while using his free hand to reward another perfectly executed trick. "So," he called out, "should we discuss the terms of my release? Fair warning, these three are coming with me. We've bonded. Also, I'm pretty sure keeping them in here constitutes substandard care under at least 16 different planetary regulations. The habitat's all wrong for starters. Silicon-based life forms need way more ventilation." The next few hours involved increasingly heated negotiations, during which Steve basically rewrote the facility's entire exotic creature handling protocols, while continuing to demonstrate proper enrichment techniques with his new scaly friends. The Zexthulians, to their credit, seemed genuinely interested in his expertise once they got over their initial shock and wounded pride. "Remember," Steve said as he prepared to board the transport that would take him and the Drakes back to Earth, "positive reinforcement works on pretty much every species, even you guys." He tossed a spare bag of methane treats to Bugsy, who caught it reflexively. "Maybe try that instead of the whole throw them in with monsters approach next time." The guard's antenna twitched in what might have been embarrassment. As the transport lifted off, Steve settled back in his seat, surrounded by contentedly purring dragons. He pulled out his comm unit and began composing a message to his supervisor back at the wildlife park. "Dear management, good news and bad news. Bad news, got kidnapped by aliens again. Good news, found us 3 new additions to the Dangerous Predators exhibit. We'll need to requisition about 3 tons of methane crystals per week for treats. Also, might have accidentally initiated a reform of the Zexthulian Empire's prisoner rehabilitation system. P.S. Remember how you said the Xenozoology conference was a waste of time? Guess whose knowledge of silicon-based predator psychology just saved his life. Best regards, Steve." He attached a selfie with the Drakes for good measure, then hit send. The largest Drake nuzzled his shoulder, probably hoping for another treat. "You know," Steve mused, scratching under its chin, "I probably should have mentioned to them that Earth's gravity is only about half of what you lot are used to. You're going to be way more active once we get home." He grinned, already imagining the looks on his co-workers' faces. "That'll be a fun surprise for everyone." The Drake made a sound suspiciously like a chuckle, and Steve couldn't help but laugh along. Some days he really loved his job. When the story of Steve's imprisonment finally made its way through official channels to the Galactic Council, it caused quite a stir. The Zexthulian Empire found itself facing an unexpected PR crisis, as video footage of their supposedly deadly execution chamber being turned into what appeared to be an impromptu training seminar went viral across the galaxy. The incident led to several major reforms, including the establishment of the first Zexthulian Zoo and Wildlife Preservation Center, with Steve hired on as a consultant, much to his supervisor's continued exasperation. The 3 Pyrethian flame drakes became starring attractions at the Sydney Interplanetary Wildlife Park, though visitors often commented that they seemed surprisingly well behaved for creatures once used as execution methods, and if sometimes, late at night, security cameras caught Steve sneaking into their enclosure for what appeared to be dragon-sized cuddle sessions. Well, that was just good animal husbandry, wasn't it? The only remaining mystery was how he'd managed to keep that clicker hidden during multiple security searches. But Steve wasn't telling. After all, a good zookeeper never reveals all their secrets. You never know when you might need them again. 6 months after the dragon incident, as it had become known in diplomatic circles, Steve found himself standing in front of the newly established Zexthulian High Council for Xenobiological Research and Conservation. The chamber, designed to accommodate various species' environmental needs, hummed with atmosphere processors and gravitational adjusters. "Let me make sure I understand correctly," Steve said, examining the holographic proposal floating before him. "You want to create an entire division dedicated to studying and preserving dangerous species, and you want me to train your trainers?" High Counselor Xerix, whom Steve was delighted to recognize as his old friend Bugsy, emanated what the translator rendered as a mixture of resignation and amusement. "Your methods, while unorthodox, have proven remarkably effective. The success rate of our rehabilitation programs has increased by 300% since implementing your positive reinforcement protocols. And the treats budget has increased by 500%. Another council member chittered, mandibles clicking in what Steve had learned was their version of dry humor. "Quality positive reinforcement doesn't come cheap," Steve replied with a grin. "But consider this. How much were you spending on replacing damaged containment units before?" The chamber filled with the musical clicking of Zexthulian laughter. Steve had discovered that despite their fearsome reputation, The insectoid species had a well-developed sense of humor. They just needed someone to help them see the funny side of their own rigid protocols. However, Steve continued, activating the next slide in his presentation, if we're going to do this properly, we need to address the elephant in the room. Or should I say, the Jovian space whale in the orbital facility. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their acceleration couches. The Jovian space whale situation had been a particularly embarrassing incident involving a failed attempt to contain one of the massive void-swimming creatures. The whale had simply phased through their strongest containment fields, consumed their entire supply of processed hydrogen, and left behind a rather passive-aggressive series of gravitational pulses that, when decoded, turned out to be complaints about the quality of their stellar gas reserves. I've drawn up a comprehensive proposal for a proper xenobiological preservation program, Steve explained, expanding the holographic display to show a massive orbital facility design. Think of it less as a prison for dangerous creatures and more as a sanctuary where we can study and protect them while learning from their unique abilities. And this will prevent further incidents? Another council member asked carefully. Well, I can't guarantee there won't be any incidents, Steve admitted, but at least there'll be educational incidents. Speaking of which, how's everyone enjoying the footage from the Perithian flame drakes' first experience with Earth's gravity? Several council members chittered in amusement while watching the video playing in the corner of the display, showing the three dragons practically bouncing off the walls of their new enclosure, acting more like excited puppies than fearsome predators. The hatchlings they've produced are even more energetic, Steve added proudly. Turns out all they needed was the right environmental conditions to breed. Who knew deadly execution beasts just wanted a proper habitat and some enrichment activities? Speaking of hatchlings, Xerix interjected, perhaps you could explain why the latest clutch seems to respond to commands in your Earth language rather than standard Galactic Common. Steve tried to look innocent, which wasn't easy when facing a room full of compound eyes that could detect the slightest micro-expression. Would you believe that's just convergent evolution? The resulting wave of chittering laughter nearly overloaded the chamber's acoustic dampeners. As the meeting continued, Steve couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in 6 months. The Zexathulian Empire, once known primarily for its military might and rigid hierarchy, was quickly gaining a reputation as a pioneer in xenobiological research. Their methods of dealing with dangerous creatures had shifted from containment and elimination to understanding and cooperation. The day's agenda included reviewing plans for several new facilities, including a deep space observation post for studying void-swimming creatures, a high-gravity habitat for silicon-based life forms, and, most ambitious of all, a temporal containment zone for creatures that existed partially out of sync with normal space-time. By the way, Steve mentioned as they wrapped up the session, my team back on Earth has been working on some interesting developments in cross-species communication. We've found that the harmonic resonance patterns in Pyrethian drake vocalizations share some fascinating similarities with whale song. We're thinking of arranging an interspecies concert. The council chamber went silent as the implications sank in. You want to arrange a musical collaboration between creatures that breathe fire and creatures that swim through the void between stars? Xerix asked slowly. Well, when you put it that way, it sounds crazy, Steve admitted. But consider this. Both species show remarkable intelligence, complex social structures, and a proven ability to learn new behaviors. Plus, think of the publicity. Former execution beasts perform cosmic symphony with space whales. That's the kind of headline that really sells the whole rehabilitation narrative. To his surprise, the council seemed to be seriously considering it. One member was already running calculations on expected attendance and potential diplomatic impact. There is also the matter of your latest request, Xerix mentioned, pulling up a new holographic display. You want to attempt rehabilitation work with a quantum tunneling serpent? Ah, yes. Steve brightened considerably. Fascinating creatures. They exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously and have a habit of phasing through solid matter. Traditional containment is impossible, but I have a theory about using treated methane crystals as both bait and behavioral reinforcement. The same creatures that consumed 3 of our most secure facilities? Another council member interrupted. Exactly, Steve beamed. Just think of it as an opportunity to study their digestive processes up close, very up close. Besides, I've already started preliminary work with a juvenile specimen. The council erupted in alarmed chittering. When did you acquire a quantum tunneling serpent? Xerix demanded. Oh, about 2 weeks ago, Steve said casually. It sort of followed me home after that incident with the temporal anomaly in Sector 7. Don't worry, I've been keeping it occupied with multi-dimensional puzzle toys. They're surprisingly good at solving complex geometrical problems when properly motivated. And where is this creature now? Someone asked nervously. Steve checked his tablet. According to the quantum tracker, it's currently in about 17 different locations, including... He paused. Apparently 3 of them are somewhere in this chamber. Don't worry, though. It's still working on its puzzle. It probably won't even notice we're here. Probably. The meeting adjourned shortly after that, with remarkably few objections to Steve's proposals. He suspected that the possibility of a bored quantum tunneling serpent might have expedited the approval process somewhat. As he prepared to return to his new office in the xenobiology wing, Steve's tablet chimed with a message from Earth. His supervisor had apparently discovered that he'd been testing new enrichment protocols on the flame drakes, specifically teaching them to play a modified version of fetch using superheated plasma balls. "Remind me again," the message read, "why we agreed to let you handle diplomatic relations with an empire that used to want us dead." Steve grinned as he typed his reply. "Because I'm the only one who remembered to bring treats to first contact? Also, unrelated, but how do you feel about hosting an interspecies concert? I promise the space whales will only phase through the atmosphere a little bit." He attached a video of one of the Drake hatchlings attempting to sing along with a recording of whale song, accidentally creating small sonic booms in the process. The resulting phenomenon created beautiful aurora-like patterns in the air, which the hatchling seemed quite proud of. As he sent the message, Steve glanced at the quantum probability display showing the various locations of his newest serpentine friend. One of the probability clouds was suspiciously close to the Council's treat storage facility. "Right then," he muttered, pulling out his trusty clicker and a bag of dimension-stabilized snacks. "Time to see if quantum uncertainty responds to positive reinforcement too." Just another day in the life of humanity's first, and possibly last, xenobiological diplomatic consultant. At least it was never boring. To be continued. Maybe. If the quantum probability collapses in the right way. Part 3. The Galactic Wildlife Conference. The first annual Galactic Wildlife Conservation and Research Summit was not going exactly as planned, which, Steve had to admit, was probably fitting given the subject matter. The conference center orbiting Jupiter's moon Europa had been specifically designed to accommodate representatives from over 300 species, including those that breathed methane, existed partially out of phase with normal spacetime, and one particularly interesting delegation that appeared to be sentient plasma. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted consciousness patterns," Steve addressed the assembled delegates from his position at the main podium, trying to ignore the fact that his quantum tunneling serpent, now officially named Schrödinger, was simultaneously coiled around his shoulders and exploring 17 other dimensions. "I want to thank you all for coming to this historic event, where we'll be discussing the future of interstellar wildlife preservation and rehabilitation." He paused as the universal translators caught up, converting his words into everything from subsonic rumbles to crystalline harmonic patterns. The Jovian space whales floating outside the station's massive viewing windows added their own harmonious commentary, which the translators rendered as something between philosophical poetry and a physics lecture. "As you can see from today's agenda," Steve continued, gesturing to the holographic display, "we have a packed schedule of presentations and demonstrations. However, I should note that the afternoon session on handling temporal predators may have already happened yesterday, or possibly next week. Our timeline specialists are working on pinning that down." A ripple of multi-species amusement passed through the audience. In the front row, Zurix and the ZX-Thulian delegation clicked their mandibles appreciatively. They'd come a long way from throwing people into cells with dragons. "Now, before we begin our first presentation on cross-dimensional enrichment activities, beyond the standard model of particle physics, I'd like to address the elephant in the room." Steve paused. "No, literally, there's an elephant in the room. Specifically, a hyperspatial probability elephant from the Sagittarius arm. Could someone please collapse its quantum state? It's making the catering staff nervous by existing in all possible lunch configurations simultaneously." As the situation was handled by a team of quantum probability specialists, armed with probability-stabilized peanuts, Steve couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in the past year. The Zexathulian Empire's transformation from militant expansionists to leaders in xenobiological research had sparked a galaxy-wide movement. Former prison facilities were being converted into wildlife sanctuaries, and species once considered too dangerous to exist were being studied and understood. The morning sessions went surprisingly well, despite a minor incident when a panel discussion on profitable applications of predator psychology had to be temporarily suspended due to some of the participants attempting to form a food chain right there in the conference room. Steve had resolved that situation with his trusty clicker and some quick thinking about relative dimensional physics. It was during the lunch break, scheduled across 7 different temporal zones to accommodate various species' metabolic cycles, that things got really interesting. Steve. Xerix approached him as he was attempting to eat a sandwich while simultaneously preventing Schrödinger from investigating whether food could exist in non-Euclidean space. We have a situation with the Promethean flame drake demonstration. Don't tell me, Steve sighed. They got into the quantum-stabilized treats again? Worse. Xerix's antenna twitched nervously. They've begun harmonizing with the space whales. The resonance patterns are... well, you should see for yourself. Steve followed Xerix to the main observation deck, where a remarkable scene was unfolding. The 3 original flame drakes, along with their 5 highly energetic offspring, were performing what could only be described as an interdimensional choir practice with the pod of space whales. The combined harmonics were creating visible ripples in the fabric of space-time, producing aurora-like patterns that seemed to dance between dimensions. That's actually pretty impressive, Steve admitted, pulling out his tablet to take readings. The quantum harmonic convergence is nearly perfect. Did anyone get the acoustics team to record this? It could revolutionize our understanding of cross-species communication. They're also teaching the whales to breathe fire, Xerix added dryly. Steve paused in his note-taking. In space? Hang on, that should be impossible. The physics doesn't work that way. He watched as one of the space whales demonstrated its newly acquired skill, somehow creating a plasma burst that twisted through dimensions in ways that made his eyes hurt. Okay. Apparently the physics does work that way. Fascinating. Though perhaps we should move them away from the station's fuel reserves. Before they could act on that probably sensible suggestion, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Red warning lights flashed in patterns designed to be recognizable to all known forms of consciousness, including those that experience time backwards. Attention all delegates. The station's AI announced in multiple languages simultaneously. We have detected a Class 3 temporal anomaly forming in Conference Room B. Also, the hyperspatial probability elephant has achieved quantum entanglement with the coffee machine. Please remain calm and avoid making any definitive observations that might collapse the probability wave into an unfavorable caffeine configuration. Steve checked his schedule. That would be right about when the advanced techniques in multidimensional containment workshop was supposed to start. Did anyone remember to account for the resonance between the temporal stabilization fields and the Drake-whale harmony? The look Xerix gave him suggested that nobody had thought to account for that particular interaction. Mainly because nobody had expected to need to account for fire-breathing space whales in the first place. Right then, Steve said, reaching for his clicker and emergency treat supply. Xerix, get the quantum probability team to the coffee machine. Priority 1 is preventing a caffeine probability cascade. I'll handle the temporal anomaly and the musical performance. Also, has anyone seen Schrödinger? He was supposed to be demonstrating proper quantum tunneling techniques in the afternoon session. According to the quantum trackers, your serpent is currently in Conference Room B, the coffee machine, and approximately 60% of the known universe. Ah, Steve nodded. That explains the temporal anomaly. He always gets a bit enthusiastic during demonstrations. Don't worry, I'm pretty sure I can get him to focus back down to a manageable number of dimensions. I've been working on a new positive reinforcement technique involving treats that exist in all possible states until observed. As Steve hurried toward Conference Room B, he couldn't help but grin. This was turning out to be much more exciting than the typical scientific conference. He made a mental note to update the next edition of his now best-selling book, So You're Working with Multidimensional Predators, a guide to not becoming a temporal paradox. Behind him, the space whales and flame drakes had moved on to what appeared to be an attempt at a multi-dimensional jazz fusion performance. The fabric of reality rippled in what might have been applause, or possibly mild existential concern. Just another day in the life of humanity's premier xenobiological diplomat. At least the coffee machine hadn't achieved sentience. Yet. The thing about achieving galactic fame as a xenobiological diplomat, Steve reflected, was that it tended to complicate otherwise simple activities. Like having tea with his mother. Stephen James Henderson. His mother said in that tone that transcended species and could make even Promethean flame drakes sit up straight. Why is there a quantum probability distortion eating my best teacup? Steve glanced at where Schrödinger was investigating the properties of Earl Grey tea across multiple dimensions simultaneously. He's not eating it, Mum. He's just trying to determine if it exists in a quantum state of both full and empty at the same time. It's actually quite fascinating from a physics perspective. And the dragons in the garden? They're helping Dad with the fertilizing, Steve explained, trying not to wince as another plasma burst illuminated the backyard. The roses have never looked better, you have to admit. Margaret Henderson, who had adapted to her son's unique career path with remarkable composure, simply poured another cup of tea. The fact that the tea existed in several quantum states until observed didn't seem to bother her anymore. At least tell me the space whales aren't coming to dinner again, she said. Last time they tried to harmonize with the church bells, the vicar had some very pointed questions about dimensional stability during Sunday service. Before Steve could answer, his emergency communicator chimed with the distinctive tone that indicated a priority message from the Galactic Wildlife Conservation Council. He pulled out his tablet, noting that his mother's expression suggested she knew exactly what was coming next. "I have to go, Mom," he said apologetically, already reading the alert. "There's a situation with a newly discovered species in the Carina Nebula. Apparently they've evolved to exist partially as pure mathematics. The research team's equations keep trying to solve themselves and escape." "Take a jumper," his mother said resignedly. "And don't forget to feed whatever dimension Schrödinger is currently occupying before you leave." Steve kissed her cheek, retrieved his quantum serpent from its contemplation of tea-based physics, and headed for the teleport pad he'd had installed in the garden shed, disguised as a particularly ambitious lawnmower to maintain neighborhood appearances. Moments later, he materialized in the Council's Emergency Response Center, where chaos had already taken hold in at least 3 observable dimensions. Holographic displays showed complex mathematical formulae that seemed to be actively evolving, while harried-looking researchers from various species attempted to prevent their calculations from achieving self-awareness. "Status report?" Steve asked, pulling out his trusty clicker while Schrödinger coiled around his shoulders in what might have been 4 dimensions at once. Zizrix, who had apparently been promoted to Emergency Response Coordinator. Steve suspected his handling of the coffee machine incident at the conference had something to do with that. Clicked his mandibles in distress. "The mathematical entities, as we're calling them, appear to have developed a particular fascination with prime numbers," Zirix explained. "They've already proved 3 previously unprovable theorems and are showing signs of wanting to solve the Riemann hypothesis. And this is bad because they're doing it by restructuring local space-time to match their proofs. The fabric of reality doesn't appreciate being used as scratch paper." Steve watched as a particularly elegant equation about prime number distribution tried to rewrite the gravitational constants of a nearby star system. Yes, that could be problematic. Have we tried engaging them in a less reality-altering form of mathematical discourse? "We attempted to interest them in basic arithmetic," one of the researchers offered. "They responded by inventing 17 new types of infinity, and using them to file a formal protest against the concept of limited dimensional space." "Right then," Steve said, reaching into his emergency kit. "Let's see if they respond to positive reinforcement. I've been working on a new type of treat that exists as a perfect mathematical construct while still being nutritionally viable across multiple planes of reality." He pulled out what appeared to be a Klein bottle filled with glowing symbols. "I call them Mobius munchies. They're topologically delicious." The mathematical entities, manifesting as shimmering patterns of pure logic in the air, showed immediate interest. Their equations began to shift from aggressive theorem proving to what appeared to be careful analysis of the treat's mathematical properties. "Fascinating," one of the researchers muttered, taking readings. "They're attempting to factor the flavor profile into its prime components." "The real question," Steve said as he carefully distributed the treats using a probability-stabilized dispenser, "is whether we can channel their mathematical enthusiasm into less destructive pursuits. Has anyone considered setting up a theoretical physics enrichment program?" Just then, an alarm sounded from another part of the facility. The mathematical entities, startled by the sudden input of new variables, began rapidly calculating escape trajectories through higher dimensions. "What now?" Zrix demanded, antenna twitching in agitation. A junior researcher looking somewhat singed burst into the room. "Sir, the flame drakes from the Cultural Exchange Program have discovered the space whale's newest musical composition. They're attempting to perform it in the main atrium." "I don't see the emergency in that," Steve started to say, then paused as he noticed the researcher's expression. "What exactly is this composition about?" "It appears to be an experimental piece exploring the mathematical foundations of reality through quantum harmonics," The whales are calling it A Brief History of Time in B-flat. Steve's eyes widened as he realized the implications. Are you telling me that we have a group of fire-breathing, dimensionally resonant creatures attempting to perform a mathematically precise musical interpretation of quantum physics in the same facility where we're trying to contain entities made of pure mathematics? The resulting cascade of events would later be described in scientific papers as the Great Convergence of Improbability, though Steve's mother would simply call it, "That time you nearly turned the solar system into a jazz fusion concert." The mathematical entities, attracted by the complex harmonics of the space whale composition, began trying to optimize the performance through real-time adjustment of fundamental constants. The Flame Drakes, excited by the new mathematical audience, started incorporating quantum fire effects into their performance. Schrödinger, not to be outdone, began quantum tunneling through the score itself, creating what one musician in the audience described as the most innovative use of snake-based counterpoint in contemporary cosmic jazz. And at the center of it all, Steve stood with his clicker and a bag of probability-stabilized treats, somehow managing to conduct both the performance and a breakthrough in cross-species mathematical communication. "You know," he said to Zurix, as they watched a particularly enthusiastic Drake perform a quantum-harmonized solo, while the mathematical entities provided special effects by locally altering the properties of light, "I think we might have accidentally invented a new field of science. What do you think about calling it musical mathematics in multiple manifolds?" "I think," Zurix replied dryly, "that your mother is going to have some very interesting questions about this at next week's tea." Steve grinned as he tossed a Mobius munchie to a mathematical entity,